Good morning, everyone. We're ready to kick off on our first session for today. We're here discussing the rise of retro, why we're looking back to look forward. I think the best thing is for the speakers to introduce themselves, because I won't do half as good a job of that as they will. So if we could perhaps start with Nick and just say a little bit about your work and the organisation that you work with.
Yeah. So my name is Nicholas, and I work for Standard Hotels. I'm the manager of design development. So my background is in architecture. I was one of the architects on the London Standard Hotel, which we opened last summer, and now work within the Standard organization in the design department, and I'm overlooking new developments.
Hi, I'm Dominic Lutyens. I'm a freelance journalist writing about design and architecture for various publications, and I've written 3 books, one on Celia Birtwell, another one on mid-century design, and another one on 1970s fashion and design.
Hi, my name is Dan Marks. I'm director of a small architecture practice called Matter Architects. We're based in West London, and we, as a reasonably new practice founded a few years ago, carry out work in a range of sectors, but mainly in the kind of residential, high-end, small boutique developers, and some hospitality work. So we did Monty's Deli, which we'll talk about at some point soon, and we're doing some other hospitality work that's under construction this quarter.
Great, so let's start a little bit more broadly, whether it's an aesthetic, an approach, or even a reaction to something happening in culture. What does the rise of retro mean to each of you?
Do you want me to start? So I look at it from a sort of nostalgic point of view, and always having something familiar to go back to, whether it's design or culture, just the familiarity of going back to something we've worked on or we've seen or you know, for my generation, and the sort of current trend of retro is looking into my parents' pictures or my grandparents' pictures and going back into that safe space, I would say, in sort of turbulent times.
So can I ask, can everyone hear okay? Sorry? Only just?
For everyone?
Okay. Right. Okay. So, should I have to talk about the aesthetic or approach question? I think it is to do with, I think it's a mixture of lots of things to do with, personally, I think it's to do with a reaction against minimalism in design, so that's an aesthetic reason. I think the 90s were very, minimalist focused, and I was trying to remember the name of that couple, the couple who used to do makeovers in the 90s. Justin and another guy, I can't remember, they were Scottish, and they used to go in and go into a house with like sort of maximalist or very old designs, and just rip the whole thing out and paint it all beige, and put blonde wood floor, wood flooring. And so I think there's there's been a long, slow burn reaction against that as one thing. And then I think also there's also this emotional component aspect, which I think is to do with very much with nostalgia and people wanting a much warmer environment, in times which are quite, in a very sort of stressful environment, and that can sort of range from our extreme, very, very busy lives to a politically turbulent time that we're going through.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, we spoke about this, and just to pick up on that, I think, nostalgia is a kind of yearning for some imagined past or some idealized past, and I think particularly in times like this we look back with rose-tinted glasses to something, to a time when America was great, when we were in control, but I think it's also about the rate and pace of technological change and a push back against that. A time when our lives and the pace of our days were slower and different, and so I think there is a yearning for that. For us as a practice, I think particularly working with existing building fabric, there's a recognition that buildings, old buildings, they have a story to tell, and we want to expose we want to expose that story. We want the building to tell its story. But at the same time, it's, when we talk about Monty's, it's not a kind of conservation project. We're not just exposing for the sake of exposing, and we do want to insert something new and add a new chapter to that building's narrative and to the story. And I think that's when something becomes interesting. It's that tension between the old and the new together, that you recognize the old, but there's something new there, and how those two play off each other.
And I want to go back to Dominic. Of course, you've written a lot of books about the 70s or mid-century design, more broadly. Do you see this current resurgence in retro design as being something that is trend-led and therefore transient, or do you think it's something that is a more deeper movement?
I mean, it's a very interesting point, because, I mean, the thing is, we've had retro, I think one thing, quite an interesting point to make is that we've had retro vogues over the last few decades. It's not just happening now. I mean, in the 80s, there was a big 50s revival, and the 70s and 80s was a big 50s revival. So there have been revivals through the ages, and I think the one at the moment is quite interesting, because I think that it's looking back at styles more in a sort of, almost like a, almost sort of from images plucked from the internet. It's more like a sort of second, third hand. It's becoming more and more second hand, third hand, fourth hand. Whereas the past retro revivals, I think, perhaps were a bit more immediate, and now they're much more mediated. But I think one thing that's quite interesting about the Standard in London is, for example, a bit like what Dan was saying, is that there is a sort of overlapping of the new and the old, because you've got Lubna Chowdhury, who's, in my opinion, a great designer. Beautiful tiles by Lubna Chowdhury in the Standard. Is it the reception or? Yeah. And that's her work. She's been working for the past 20 years, and she's always been influenced by the 60s, and the 70s. So it's hard to sort of. I think it's an ongoing thing. I don't think it's just a blip now. I think it's a progression.
And what's interesting actually about the Lubna Chowdhury piece as well is that it's really baked into the building as well, so it's not a kind of stylized sofa that can be stripped out and replaced with something else as a trend passes. But you each obviously understand the design landscape incredibly well, so beyond those examples, where do you think we're seeing the rise of retro manifest in some other specific examples, be that in brands, in hospitality, in interiors?
I would say in film and TV, we're getting a lot of, like we had Mad Men running for 5-6 seasons, which was a sort of semi-idealistic version of that time period. I'd say in design more broadly, we have more lifestyle brands. We have more stores opening which tend to reference mid-century modern furniture or modernist furniture. I don't know if you guys have anything to add.
I mean, I think that the term, the rise of retro, it was the first time I heard it when I got invited to come here by you. And I think it's a very broad, sort of all-encompassing, but, there's one person's approach to retro or one person's understanding of that is very different to another's. So I think there's very many different, from the kind of pastiche, just copy-paste something, to more subtle interpretations that Dominic's talking about, that's kind of, the layering and the mediation between things. But then the immediate sort of brands, I suppose, that come to mind, or examples in hospitality. I mean, one I particularly like is the TWA terminal at JFK that's sort of been given new lease of life as a hotel. And I think that, and very similar to the Standard hotels that sort of take, buildings that, the Standard Hotel in London was sort of earmarked for demolition, and it's in a conservation area and sort of was marked out as a building that had no positive contribution to the conservation area. And from what I understand, all the parties bidding for that site were all proposing to knock it down and build something new. So to see something that is sort of reinvented in the same building and given a new lease of life, I think that's a very positive thing. We would always kind of argue for a kind of, keep as much of the existing fabric as possible and make something of that, but reinvent it. So I think that's interesting. Then I think, the other brands that come to mind is obviously the sort of Soho House effect that kind of started this, and now there's a lot of copycats doing what they've done. And Soho House now, you can kind of go and buy their wares, and fill your house with their stuff as well.
I mean, that issue of reinvention is quite an interesting one. And you already used the words looking back at retro through slightly rose-tinted glasses. So obviously it's a version of retro for today, but what makes, I guess, something authentically retro design in terms of color and motif and pattern or even materials?
Do you want to take on that? So I can describe sort of our take on retro, which I think sort of feels authentic, at least to me, is that we do reference colors and patterns and shapes, so everything's slightly more curvy sometimes, but we do also like to keep things functional. So like in our hotels you would still see a sort of retro 70s or 60s looking phone, but it won't be a rotary phone, it will be like a phone with buttons that you can quickly dial something. So we try not to become a theme park, and we try to reference materials that were used at a time period, but in combination with materials we use now. So there is this sort of marriage of time periods. So that is, I find, a fine line, and something I personally keep an eye out when I visit other properties or other, hoteliers who reference such things. So yeah, with us it's in the balance, and also having a designer who has a background from California, and he has a film design background as well. So he sort of treats our spaces as sort of different stories within a larger film.
This is Sean Houseman.
Yeah. So Sean Houseman treats the brief and sort of the entire building as you're walking through a film. So you have different scenes happening in different areas, but they all sort of homogeneously sort of reference each other.
I was just thinking that there's a sort of a bit like, I think what Dan's hinted at or referred to is the fact that we're living in a modern age with modern technology, and so that has to be married to when you're talking about hospitality projects. For example, I wrote about the SS Royal Copenhagen Hotel in Copenhagen, which was designed by Arne Jacobsen in the very early 60s, and all the bedrooms have all been pretty much kept. It was a big restoration project, and the bedrooms have been pretty much kept as they were originally, but they had these bulky air conditioning units which were all taken out. So there's a sort of kind of dealing with what do people want for a comfortable environment and an efficient environment. How do you marry that with a retro aesthetic? I think that's something that's quite important now. I don't know.
Yeah, for me, the question of what is authentic, it's not one I can really answer. I'm less, I suppose because I'm less interested in it. But what I am interested in is how things are reinterpreted, and I'm kind of thinking about a particular product that comes to mind as a good example, and it's there's a classic lamp by Achille Castiglione, Italian designer of 70s, late 60s, 70s?
50s, 60s, 70s,
okay.
Yeah.
And it's called the Parentesi, and it's just a really simple, beautiful, it's hung from the ceiling with a counterweight that just hangs a few millimeters above the ground, and it has just a really simple exposed light bulb that you can pull up and down and rotate. So you can position it, next to where you're sat reading, put it away, you can put it down and uplight. It can do many things. It's really simple. And Konstantin Grcic has reinterpreted that Parentesi, and it's just a brilliant reinterpretation. It's the same diagram of a line and a light moving up and down on it and rotating, but it's now an LED, which is off our time. It's a much more efficient light source, a much better light source, a much longer lasting and sustainable light source, and it's a much higher quality light. And so and for me, it's just a beautiful piece and a brilliant reinterpretation of a classic piece that I love.
And on that theme of reinterpretation, where does the line lie then between kind of respectful referencing of the past and perhaps a slightly boring regurgitation of the past? Do we need to avoid pastiche?
I would say personally for me it lies where did you have to reinvent that, whatever piece you're reinventing, or are you essentially just sort of reproducing something that you haven't really changed. And like for me, the question is, what was the reason for reinterpreting it? Otherwise, for me, it wouldn't be unauthentic or something worth looking at.
I don't know. I feel that it could be a bit too. I think I think one thing is that people are becoming much more. A lot of people are much more aware of history and aware of different designers. I mean, magazines and books are full of information about people, other designers, and people have sort of accumulating all this knowledge. And some of it is just sort of visual, kind of almost like visual wallpaper. That you just pick up these. It could be David Hicks, or it could be I don't know. Memphis, for example. Memphis is a huge influence now on design, but people don't necessarily know the ins and outs of what these designers are doing, what their aims are doing. It's more like and I think you can get a bit too puritanical and purist about, do you have to sort of reference this all in a very knowledgeable way, or can you just, create an environment, an atmosphere?
So the question was, where is the fine line between
pastiche and maybe a new interpretation?
I think it is a fine line. I think that we are, as a practice, more interested in reinterpretation, which I've talked about. But I also think that we talked about nostalgia and the emotional component, and I think certain pieces or ideas of design have real meaning, emotional kind of meaning. And so I am interested in where we can appropriate certain things, but then what layers what layers do we add, and how do we mediate it and reinterpret it? Is that an answer?
I quite like that as we're talking about retro, we've turned into Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, so watch your heads. But going back to the standard then, I mean, as a design journalist, I've been asked to write about that so much, unusually much. Yeah. And I think you only need to talk to people to see that project has really resonated and landed with such a thud. Can you tell us a little bit about the design process on that project and why you think it has resonated so powerfully with people?
Yeah, so like it was mentioned earlier, we were the only hotelier bidding for the existing building, which used to be the old Camden Town Hall, that didn't want to demolish it. So that immediately seemed to have put us on top of the list. So we wanted to reinterpret the building. We did some key functional changes into the building, one of which was connecting the sort of back garden of the building that people couldn't cross over when it was functioning as Camden Town Hall. And we widened the Euston Road connection with the back neighborhoods as well. So that's a very big positive change to the locals. And then the back of the building now has an outward-facing garden, so you walk through this sort of green area on your commute. We animated the facade, so we cleaned the facade. We changed the glass windows, so the building immediately looked a lot better. And then we got rid of one of the sort of dark cores, and we added this sort of red lipstick elevator that takes you up to the 10th floor. So externally, the appearance of the building changed, I think, to become better. And then internally, I think one thing that really stands out with the standard is that once you're in, and knowing you're in a hotel, there's no sort of comparable immediate reference around you. So within a radius of miles and miles, there's nothing that looks like the standard. And there's so much going on visually, and then the program of the building that stands out with people, which I presume that might be why you kept getting asked to write about it. Like the Lubna Chowdhury installation that was mentioned earlier, we like to incorporate art in our buildings, but we never frame it on a wall, so it becomes part of the fabric. And I think to a greater extent, is the ground floor makes you curious to see what's going on upstairs, because everything feels so different, sort of hybridly defined, so there's no like strict boundaries within the rooms. So I think the building itself probably, yeah.
And then one of the interesting things about that project, which actually opens it up into a question for each of you, is I toured the project with Sean Houseman, and he made a big point of the location, the fact that it's at King's Cross. It's almost at a crossroads with the rest of Europe.
Yeah.
and therefore there's this very international feel. When it comes to retro, unlike some other design movements like Nordic or something like that, where it's tied to a particular geographic region or a certain design sensibility tied to a culture, is there something about retro that is perhaps more inclusive because it's something that we can all understand and it doesn't have those same geographic ties?
I mean, I would like to think so, that retro generally is a time period. I mean, we're looking back into a time period, and I'd like to think that wherever you are from in the world, you do get that feeling. Like there's similar references. I imagine there was similar movements happening in different parts of the world, and that's one thing that I think makes you feel familiar with it.
Well, I think part of the retro appeal is the eclecticism of retro, and you get all these layers of patterns and colours, and they reference lots of different cultures, I think, because you have very interesting mid-century Brazilian design. You have, mid-century design was almost an international movement, or certainly a Western movement, and so there are all these buttons that can be pushed. I think I'm not a designer, but I think designers can push all these buttons, referencing lots of different cultures, and so I think from that perspective, the retro thing can appeal to a very wide audience because it's referring to so many different traditions and other designers.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is, kind of talk about the emotional component of it. It's exactly that. It's pushing buttons, isn't it? But I think also what's interesting about the standard, and in light of the standard sort of, accelerated expansion and opening up all around the world, is that, on the one hand, there is a kind of recognizable brand. I think what's really exciting, well, I think what makes it really successful is the kind of immersive experience of going in there and it being, as you say, something completely different. But then at the same time, the kind of the flip side, or the pushing against the global thing. What I thought was interesting about the standard in London was the kind of references to the Route Master with that red lipstick elevator on the outside, and then the whole kind of riff on London transport. I understood that they kind of, well, you can tell us more about it, how they took the people who did the original sort of upholstery for the, found them to do upholstery in bedrooms. So there's, again, it's kind of pushing those buttons, isn't it? But it's but it's also, it's a kind of local brand, if you like.
Yeah, we did. Basically the original TFL designers of all the fabrics we see in transportation now were invited and informed the design of our carpets in all areas. So that sort of combined the location of being in transit between the west and the east parts of London, but also being so close to Eurostar and branching out to Europe. And then another element that I forgot to mention was that we reinstated the public library that the Camden Town Hall used to house within the building. So once you enter the building, you're in the public library, and we have an in-house concept librarian that went out and found books for us, and then are now part of the building, so guests can come in and work and use the space without necessarily having to spend a lot of money, and then you can read the books, return them, and then borrow them another day. But we did try to use local elements to reference the area, so that then the interesting thing about the standard hotels is that each hotel looks different. So there's only one element that we use in all properties, and it's the bin in the toilets. That's the only thing that you'll find in every single standard property. Everything else is entirely different, but they all have the same vibe. And I think it's because we look into the areas we inhabit into through the same eyes. So we have the same approach, and then we bring elements in the same way, but they're different, but it's still the same concept wherever we are.
And it's quite democratic as well, because of course you don't need to stay overnight to have a really expansive offer, the sheer amount of public space in that property as well. I mean, as people connected to the design world, how many people here have been to the Standard in London yet? Okay, that was not what I was expecting.
A treat in store.
So moving on to Monty's then, because of course you didn't cling too rigorously to a particular kind of retro aesthetic, but instead you would be open about the fact that you looked at almost retro ideas around hospitality, classic ideas of hospitality, and how to reinterpret that for today. So can you tell us a little bit more about that project?
Yes. I mean, I don't know, is there anything...
I think they're coming up a few slides after this.
I mean, with Monty's, there were two main drivers to the project. One was the venue, the building itself, which when our client took the lease for the building, had been a bakery for the past 40 years, but before that it was a Victorian butcher's. And the baker that had been in there, that was also the landlord, had covered all of the original features over, and there we could see glimpses. We knew that there were some lovely old Victorian tiles and a Victorian sort of harlequin checker floor and some other nice features that tell the story of the building, but they'd all been, plastered over, stud wall over, vinyled over, just everything had been completely covered. And so the first thing we wanted to do was to expose that, not so much in a kind of conservation sort of, piece it together way, but just first of all, strip it back, clean it, and expose what's there. And then the other part of the brief was our client wanted the sort of look and feel of the old London cafe. And so that then, for us, the challenge was, I suppose, to bring something of that to the project, but not a kind of replica, not a pastiche, and that is the fine line. And so our approach to that was to look at what are the things that are successful in London cafes, and extract them. So, for instance, we knew we wanted booth seating. What about the booth seating did we like? It was something about, there were proportions. They weren't overly sort of luxurious booth seating. They're quite cozy. It was about the height of the back of the booth. So we didn't want the back to go all the way up so that you didn't see your neighbours, but we actually wanted this sort of moment of, oh, sorry, I bumped into you. You might actually kind of overhear, talk to people, but just that kind of coziness. It was about the lighting. We wanted sort of globe lights that illuminated the space in front of you, people's faces, the food, but that, above and around that it was dark. So it's, I suppose, more extracting the sort of diagrammatic elements that work, but then reinterpreting them. So also looking at materials, but then putting those materials back together in a different way, different detailing, and it is that reinterpretation. And then the juxtaposition of the old and the new. So we sort of made a rule very early on. We said everything we can expose, we'll expose. What we expose and looks awful or is kind of falling apart, we'll replace. We're not going to be too kind of stick to the rules. We'll bend them here and there. But then the new that we're inserting, we wanted to stick to kind of a datum of 1100 above finished floor level that coincided with the top of the bar, with the bar counter, and roughly sort of, I think it was something like 35 centimetres above ground, which is the underside of the seat. Everything above that and everything below that is as found. And it's that contrast that, that I find interesting.
How then do you think, in terms of approach, we can look to the past to perhaps inform new and innovative ways of doing things?
I would say, well, looking selectively to the past, and there's definitely a lot of honesty and sort of functionality in especially modernist design that we can learn from in an era where everything, I feel, is a little bit oversaturated, and you have options at sort of your fingertips at constant times. I'd say looking back to the qualities of the function that we want to bring back. I don't know.
So, sorry, you mean what can we learn from the past? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so I mean, with Monty's as an example, for example, it's not just the aesthetic, but it's also a style of hospitality, perhaps, that is more social, more experiential. So that's one example of looking back to actually rethink how we might approach a hospitality space for today. So it could be something in design, it could be something in concept or approach, but what are some of the strands, perhaps, from a retro period that might actually be able to be applied today in a more innovative way?
In a more innovative way. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think Lubna Chowdhury is a good example. I mean, although she's been doing her work for a long time, but I don't know, for me it's about the spirit of the times and there's a sort of joyousness to a lot of 70s and 60s design that is lacking in some ways, has been lacking in some ways. And I think that, hospitality environments, restaurants and hotels are a great opportunity to bring some of that joy, because people want some of this sort of feeling, you could call it escapist, but people want to be in a theatrical, glamorous environment. And I think that's something that can be really ramped up in hospitality environments. And in a way, people may not want to live like that in their homes because it's not very calming, perhaps. But when they're out, they want that sort of glamour factor. I don't know whether that answered your question in any way.
No, I think that's true. I think there is certainly an element of escapism, and that there's something, you go out, you want to immerse yourself in something very different. So I agree with all of that. I think also from a design point of view, looking back at the past and in order to look forward as well, I look at the kind of mid-century modern pieces, so many classics that we love and that will, that endure. And a lot of, there was, as Nicholas said, they're kind of based on principles of simplicity and kind of functionalism, but they were also driven by modes of production. It was the first time that the 50s, that all of these objects kind of went from pure craft, kind of local, to more global and mass-produced and found their way into our homes. And I think that it's interesting now, with the rate of technological change, how can we, on the one hand, harness technology and new modes of production, but at the same time, we kind of need to move away from the kind of throwaway culture, from, the other thing that kind of came out of the 50s is kind of plastic injection molding, and, what technologies can we use today, but merge them in a way with kind of craft and things that endure, that, that we're not going to throw away, that are going to, that are going to form sort of central pieces for decades to come.
I think that really ties into the modern notion of sustainability as well. I mean, there's tons of stuff in my own living room that I found on Etsy, and I love the fact that you're giving something a new life, and it is design that feels timeless and enduring. I'd love to see if anyone in the audience has any questions for the panel. No, then a quick plug. We're back here again in... Oh, we do.
Sorry, it's for Nicholas on the Standard Hotel.
Yep.
I haven't been inside, but I've been past it outside. How do you think retro kind of came into the building design in terms of the extension you did on the roof?
So the roof, so the scale and the sort of rhythm of the roof references the existing Brutalist building. So that's sort of like an immediate visual reference of the existing of something retro. Another interesting element of the roof is that you have this pretty tall, like 7-story existing Brutalist building that's all concrete, and then both on the 8th floor, which is now the extension from the old roof up, and on the ground floor we use timber, which is a material that was used a lot in sort of West Coast America, and in a time period that we were interested in to reference, but also because it gives you the it means that on a human scale you can touch something that's warm and familiar to you and sort of pulls you away from the Brutalist. So we referenced it, I'd say, in rhythm, scale, and materials for the extension.
Anything else? Yep.
Hi, I'd just like to ask the panel, I've relaunched our family dairy business that was founded in 1888. I'm quite interested to know how far I should go back to using our history and our sort of heritage in our modern day business, which is a deli, cafe, gelateria, etc. And how much of that is relevant today?
I think it's very difficult. Well, it's difficult to answer that question without understanding what, I suppose, for want of a better word, the assets are. The kind of, the buildings, are they 150 years old? then I think yes. I think I think we would be interested in looking at that and looking at where you can use those things as part of your brand, as part of it's quite simple.
So we're back here in 45 minutes, looking at how to use colour for 2020. And in the meantime, if you can join me in saying thank you to our panellists, Nick, Dominic, and Dan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.